In the highly choreographed world of international diplomacy, presidents of nations heavily endorsed by Western institutions do not openly praise governments born from military interventions. They are expected to issue standard condemnations, support regional economic embargoes, and align strictly with the diplomatic consensus dictated by traditional global powers. Yet, a seismic fracture in this established political order has just occurred in southern Africa. The newly elected President of Botswana, Duma Boko, a leader operating within a system widely praised by the international community as a standard of traditional governance, stood before the microphones and openly commended Captain Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso. This was not a slip of the tongue or a misinterpreted diplomatic gesture. It was a calculated, deliberate acknowledgement of a governing model that is actively dismantling decades of geopolitical orthodoxy across the Sahel. The global political establishment expects African leaders to distance themselves from the Alliance of Sahel States. Instead, they are watching, evaluating, and taking meticulous notes on the sheer, undeniable speed of its execution. To understand the immense gravity of this endorsement, one must listen closely to the exact framing used by the leadership in Gaborone. President Boko pointed to a highly specific and highly coveted metric of governance: the ability to translate political will into immediate physical reality. He noted that in Burkina Faso, when a decision is made in the best interest of the nation, it immediately transitions into law, policy, and most importantly, visible action. There is no endless parliamentary gridlock engineered by foreign lobbying. There is no paralyzing debate deliberately designed to stall industrial development until multinational corporations can position themselves to extract maximum value from the situation. For leaders across the continent, this observation strikes at the very heart of their own silent institutional frustrations. They are tasked with leading nations rich in strategic minerals and boundless potential. Yet they find themselves bound by administrative architectures that make rapid, sovereign economic pivots nearly impossible. Africa is currently experiencing a profound continent-wide sense of fatigue with administrative paralysis. For over half a century, the blueprint for post-colonial governance was sold as a system that would guarantee prosperity, stability, and seamless integration into the global economy. Yet, the lived reality for many resource-rich nations has been an exhausting cycle of managing external expectations rather than building internal sovereign capacity. The traditional 5-year political cycle has proven highly effective at changing faces, but deeply inadequate for constructing the 50-year industrial foundations a nation requires to truly develop. When a leader operating within this conventional multi-party framework attempts to abruptly halt the export of raw materials, seeking instead to force local industrialization, they are instantly met with a formidable wall of institutional resistance. This resistance is rarely organic to the population. It is often funded, amplified, and sustained by external economic interests that benefit directly from a weakened, slow-moving state apparatus. The friction is placed there by design, ensuring that structural economic transformation remains trapped in perpetual debate rather than actualization. This is precisely why the developments in Ouagadougou are capturing the undivided attention of state houses thousands of miles away. Burkina Faso has inadvertently transformed into a real-time, high-stakes laboratory for economic sovereignty. Under Ibrahim Traore, the administration is bypassing the traditional roadblocks that have historically derailed African industrial ambitions. They are demonstrating exactly what happens when a state reclaims absolute authority over its subterranean wealth and dictates the terms of engagement to global markets, rather than asking for permission to develop. This is not merely about a shift in political titles or administrative reshuffling. It is a fundamental restructuring of how an African state interacts with global capital. The administration in Ouagadougou is demanding that value addition happens on domestic soil, a rigid policy shift that is sending shockwaves through the global supply chains that have long relied on the Sahel as a reliable source of cheap, unprocessed commodities. When a Southern African head of state publicly validates the governance speed of a Sahelian leader, it signals a deeper paradigm shift sweeping across the entire continent. It reveals an emerging, undeniable consensus that the core metric for successful leadership is shifting permanently. It is no longer solely about adhering to external definitions of political propriety, but about the tangible, measurable capacity to protect national resources, secure territorial integrity against complex security crises, and lay the concrete foundations for heavy industry. The old playbook, which required African leaders to measure their success by the amount of foreign praise they received from overseas capitals, is rapidly losing its grip. A new metric is taking hold, one judged by the speed at which a government can build a domestic processing plant, secure a sovereign mining perimeter, and guarantee that the wealth of the land finally serves the people who walk upon it. The silent observers across the continent recognize this profound shift, and their quiet validation speaks volumes about the future trajectory of African statecraft. To comprehend why Burkina Faso's current trajectory is sending such intense tremors through the corridors of international power, we must first dissect the structural mechanism that has kept the continent in a state of arrested development. This mechanism is often referred to as second-hand democracy. The political models exported to African nations following formal independence were not designed to build industrial powerhouses. They were designed to manage existing extractive economies while maintaining an outward appearance of self-determination. In highly industrialized nations, established institutions manage wealth and infrastructure that have already been developed over centuries. In Africa, these imported political systems demand that leaders focus almost entirely on surviving the next 5-year election cycle. A 5-year administrative horizon is fundamentally incompatible with the 50 to 100-year planning required to construct heavy industry, build robust domestic supply chains, and completely overhaul a national education system. When a sovereign leader attempts to look decades ahead to restructure the national economy, they are immediately penalized by a framework built exclusively for short-term political survival. This brings us to the absolute core of the continent's economic paralysis, the mono-sectoral trap. The vast majority of African economies were carefully engineered decades ago to serve a single function, which is to supply the global market with raw, unprocessed materials. Whether the commodity is gold, crude oil, or rare earth elements, the physical infrastructure, from the layout of the railways to the capacity of the deep water ports, was built to funnel wealth out of the continent as quickly and cheaply as possible, never to circulate it within. The domestic education and administrative systems were similarly structured to produce a steady stream of administrative staff and low-wage labor for foreign-owned extraction operations, rather than training a generation of specialized engineers capable of refining those resources locally. As a result, when global markets demand raw materials, the continent supplies them, but the staggering, compounding profits generated from manufacturing, processing, and intellectual property remain permanently locked in foreign capitals. Observe the profound shifts currently attempting to take root across the Southern African development community, shifts that deeply contextualize the recent praise directed toward Ouagadougou. Zimbabwe has implemented aggressive policies to restrict the export of raw lithium, essentially demanding that foreign corporations build processing facilities locally if they wish to access the critical minerals. Simultaneously, Botswana is maneuvering to become the regional hub for electric mobility and advanced manufacturing, seeking targeted collaboration with neighboring states rather than competing in a race to the bottom for raw export contracts. These governments are attempting to break the historic extractive cycle. However, they are doing so while facing a monumental systemic risk. When a sovereign state abruptly shuts off the export of raw materials to force local beneficiation, the immediate consequence is not sudden prosperity. The immediate consequence is a severe, highly destabilizing economic shock. The nation loses its primary source of foreign exchange almost overnight, building the physical infrastructure required to actually process these minerals. Complex smelters, advanced refineries, and high-capacity power grids takes years. It requires massive capital investment and demands specialized intellectual property that has historically been kept out of reach for developing nations. During this painful transition period, the domestic economy inevitably contracts. Citizens feel the immediate financial squeeze, and the government is forced to find a way to absorb a massive revenue hit while keeping essential state functions operational. This specific window of economic vulnerability is exactly where the trap of external influence snaps shut. The moment a leader begins to seriously disrupt the uninterrupted flow of cheap raw materials, the resulting short-term economic pain is swiftly weaponized. Foreign capital is withdrawn, and international financial institutions begin issuing severe credit downgrades. More strategically, this acute economic distress is utilized to finance, organize, and amplify domestic opposition factions, operating under the protective banner of democratic freedom and civil rights. These groups are often heavily supported by the exact external entities that stand to lose billions from a sovereign African industrial base. The international narrative is quickly manipulated, shifting from a story about a nation enduring the necessary growing pains of economic independence to a story of a government allegedly failing its citizens. The structural design of these imported political systems ensures that any leader attempting to genuinely alter the economic destiny of their nation will face intense, well-funded internal resistance long before their industrial vision can ever materialize. This is the exact cycle of systemic sabotage that the leadership in Burkina Faso is currently attempting to shatter by prioritizing rapid, decisive action over endless political appeasement. To truly grasp the human magnitude of this profound geopolitical realignment, one must look beyond the assembly halls of state capitals and peer into the dust-swept mining perimeters of the Sahel. To understand the true weight of this transition, imagine stepping into the lived reality of a young, heavy machinery mechanic in a mineral-rich district of Burkina Faso. Let us call him Ousmane. Ousmane's story is not merely a singular, isolated biography. It represents the collective memory and the present daily reality of millions of young Africans standing at the absolute epicenter of this continental economic upheaval. For the vast majority of his life, Ousmane grew up walking over earth that held unimaginable wealth. Yet his daily reality was defined by an engineered, systemic scarcity. His formal education was never designed to teach him the metallurgy required to refine the resources buried beneath his feet. Instead, the institutional framework was meticulously structured to produce a compliant, low-wage workforce capable of operating basic machinery for foreign extraction conglomerates. For years, Ousmane worked punishing, relentless shifts loading raw, unrefined earth onto massive transport fleets. He watched day after day as the wealth of his nation was hauled away to distant ports, eventually crossing oceans to be processed, patented, and sold at astronomical markups in foreign markets. In this entrenched system, Ousmane was never meant to be an innovator, a shareholder, or an engineer. He was categorized simply as an expendable asset in a global supply chain that required his nation to remain permanently anchored at the bottom of the economic ladder. His wages were carefully calculated to be just enough to sustain his basic survival, keeping him locked in a cycle of dependency that left absolutely no room for long-term planning or upward mobility. Then comes the sudden directive from the central administration, the exact type of rapid, decisive governance that leaders across the continent are now quietly praising. The government mandates a complete, non-negotiable halt to the export of specific raw materials, demanding that processing facilities be constructed within the national borders. For international financial markets, this is read as a severe supply chain disruption. But for Ousmane, it is an immediate, terrifying reality. The foreign conglomerate, refusing to comply with the new domestic beneficiation laws and accustomed to dictating terms to African states, abruptly suspends its operations. The massive transport trucks stop rolling. The mining perimeter falls dead silent, and Ousmane loses his sole source of income overnight. This is the painful contraction. This is the severe economic shock that external institutions historically rely upon to generate internal political collapse. In the immediate aftermath, there is profound anxiety. The financial squeeze tightens mercilessly on Ousmane's community. Whispers of instability, frequently amplified by external broadcasting networks, begin to circulate through the district. The transition away from a dependency economy is not a romantic celebration. It is a grueling, agonizing test of national endurance. Ousmane finds himself caught in the brutal, frightening gap between the collapse of the old extractive model and the promised birth of a new sovereign industrial base. He is forced to navigate months of uncertainty, watching his savings evaporate while international observers predict the inevitable failure of his country's leadership. However, this is where the current trajectory of the Sahel deviates sharply from historical precedents. Rather than yielding to the immense external pressure to reopen the raw export pipelines to save their political careers, the administration holds the line. They rapidly redirect national resources and forge new, equitable partnerships to begin building domestic processing infrastructure. Months into the economic drought, a state-backed initiative breaks ground on a local refining facility. Usman, possessing years of mechanical familiarity with the raw materials, is absorbed into a rigorous national retraining program. The curriculum is completely rewritten. It is no longer focused on how to extract and export, but rigorously centered on advanced processing technology, equipment maintenance, and industrial management. When the new domestic plant finally powers on, Usman is no longer loading raw dirt into a foreign-owned truck. He is operating the complex control panels of a facility that refines the minerals on sovereign soil. He is earning a wage that reflects the true compounded value of his labor. More importantly, he has been fundamentally transformed from a marginalized laborer into a foundational pillar of his nation's new industrial economy. Through the lens of citizens like Usman, the actions of the leadership cease to be abstract political theory. They become the highly tangible reclamation of human dignity. When leaders in Southern Africa openly praise the decisiveness of the Sahel, they are acknowledging this exact transformation. They are watching a government absorb the terrifying shock of economic separation and successfully bridge the gap toward true industrial sovereignty, proving to the rest of the continent that while the transition is agonizing, it is entirely possible. However, to view the Alliance of Sahel States solely through a lens of triumphant independence would be a dangerous oversimplification. The reality of asserting economic sovereignty in the 21st century is incredibly harsh. Transitioning away from a deeply entrenched extractive economic model is not a ceremonial event. It is a grueling geopolitical gauntlet. The governments in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey are not just drafting new domestic policies. They are actively severing the lucrative financial lifelines of some of the most powerful corporate entities on the planet. This level of systemic disruption to global supply chains inevitably invites a crushing, multifaceted backlash. History provides a chilling, undeniable map of this exact geopolitical retaliation. The African continent is scattered with the unfinished legacies of leaders who attempted to restructure the global flow of resources. When a head of state moves to nationalize subterranean wealth or block the free export of raw minerals to foreign ports, the response from the international establishment is rarely diplomatic debate. Decades ago, Patrice Lumumba stood before the Congolese people and declared that the immense mineral wealth of the nation must finally serve its own citizens. His push for absolute economic sovereignty triggered immediate foreign intervention, resulting in his forced ouster and a subsequent era of profound instability that continues to extract a massive human toll today. These historical warnings are embedded deep within Burkina Faso's own soil. The decisive leadership of Thomas Sankara in the 1980s presented a terrifying prospect for the old colonial powers. Sankara understood that external debt was being utilized as an invisible mechanism of control, forcing African nations to surrender their natural resources to pay off international loans they never actually benefited from. He publicly rejected this financial subjugation and moved aggressively to make his nation self-sufficient. for daring to propose that Africa should consume what it produces and process what it mines, his administration was swiftly dismantled, and he was permanently removed from the political landscape. The methodology of suppressing sovereign ambition has evolved, but the underlying objective remains unchanged. When Muammar Gaddafi proposed pooling the continent's resources to create a unified African currency backed by gold, a move that would have instantly shattered external financial dominance, the global media apparatus rapidly mobilized to destroy his international standing. Complex domestic issues were weaponized to justify overwhelming external intervention. More recently, when John Magufuli of Tanzania implemented a shock doctrine to halt the export of raw minerals and force international mining conglomerates to the negotiating table, he was immediately subjected to intense international pressure. The playbook is highly consistent. The international apparatus exploits the vulnerabilities of imported multi-party systems, funneling massive financial support to domestic opposition factions. The moment a leader challenges the extractive consensus, they are heavily branded as an authoritarian threat, setting the stage for economic isolation or organized domestic unrest. This historical context brings us directly to the severe, ongoing security crisis currently suffocating the Sahel region. It is a matter of intense geopolitical scrutiny that insurgencies and armed groups often experience rapid, highly organized expansion in exact parallel with a host nation's attempt to secure its strategic mineral reserves. The security vacuums in these resource-dense areas are rarely organic phenomena. They are complex crises, frequently exacerbated by the very foreign entities that offer conditional military assistance. When the administration in Ouagadougou moved to expel foreign military bases and reclaim total territorial control, the frequency of security incidents in strategic zones predictably escalated. This is the brutal reality of the geopolitical chessboard. Armed instability serves as a highly effective pressure valve, forcing sovereign governments to divert their limited national budgets away from industrial infrastructure and into endless security operations. This overwhelming multi-front pressure is precisely what makes the current resilience of Burkina Faso so globally significant. Ibrahim Traore and his regional allies are operating under a state of perpetual economic and security siege. They are facing organized diplomatic isolation, sophisticated financial embargoes, and relentless territorial challenges from well-equipped armed factions. Yet, despite these monumental obstacles, they continue to lay the groundwork for domestic processing facilities and regional economic integration. This is the overarching macro narrative that has leaders like Duma Boko taking careful notes. The entire African continent is watching, holding its breath, to see if a coalition of states can finally survive the systemic retaliation that has historically suppressed every prior attempt at achieving true, uncompromised economic sovereignty. The public validation traveling from the capital of Botswana to the heart of Burkina Faso represents a tectonic fracture in the established geopolitical order of the continent. It shatters the long-held institutional illusion that compliance with external economic demands is the only viable path to national stability. When a head of state, operating within the boundaries of a traditional multi-party system that the global north heavily monitors, openly admires the sheer velocity of execution demonstrated by the Sahel. It is a profound admission. It is an acknowledgement that the old rulebook is becoming dangerously obsolete. African leaders are increasingly realizing that the frameworks they inherited were never actually designed to facilitate heavy industrialization. Rather, they were carefully engineered mechanisms of permanent extraction. The era of the imported democratic model, a system that inherently prioritizes surviving the next 5-year election cycle over mapping out a 50-year industrial renaissance, is facing its most formidable and effective ideological challenger in decades. What Ibrahim Traore has introduced to the contemporary African political landscape is the strategic weaponization of speed and absolute decisiveness. In a global economy where multinational conglomerates rely on bureaucratic inertia and endless parliamentary debate to maintain their monopolies over raw resources, immediate action becomes a revolutionary act. Halting the export of unrefined wealth is not merely an aggressive economic policy. It is a definitive declaration of sovereign boundaries. It forces the international community to accept a new reality. The soil of the Sahel and the vast mineral wealth embedded within it belong first and foremost to the people who reside there. The regional leaders, quietly taking notes, realize that to survive the intense geopolitical competition of the coming century, they cannot simply manage poverty through foreign aid. They must aggressively engineer domestic wealth, even if achieving that requires absorbing a massive, highly destabilizing initial economic shock. The road ahead for the Alliance of Sahel States and any nation that dares to replicate this aggressive model of economic reclamation will be defined by immense institutional friction. The global supply chains will not surrender their historic profit margins voluntarily. The complex financial embargoes, the sudden withdrawal of foreign capital, and the deeply entrenched security crises will continue to test the endurance of these new sovereign administrations. But the fundamental difference emerging now is a profound sense of clarity among the population. The citizenry, representing millions of individuals who have historically been sidelined and marginalized in their own economies, are beginning to see the true, staggering cost of their previous reliance on external benefactors. The severe pain of this economic transition is increasingly viewed not as a failure of leadership, but as a necessary, unavoidable crucible through which a self-reliant industrial nation must be forged. This awakening is absolutely not confined to the borders of Burkina Faso, Mali, or Niger. From the lithium fields of Zimbabwe to the advanced mobility ambitions of Botswana, a synchronized realization is taking hold across the continent. Africa holds the critical elements required for the future of global technology, green energy, and advanced manufacturing. The continent possesses unparalleled leverage, provided it has the unified political will to actually use it. The quiet observations and public praises from neighboring heads of state indicate that a massive psychological barrier has been broken. A new generation of governance is proving in real time that an African state can absorb the organized retaliation of the traditional global establishment and remain standing. Documenting and understanding these massive geopolitical maneuvers is no longer just about following international news. It is a critical act of intellectual independence. The mainstream international narratives will consistently attempt to frame these sovereign economic transitions as crises of authoritarianism, deliberately obscuring the massive financial rebalancing occurring right beneath the surface. If you refuse to accept the narrative that African nations must remain perpetual exporters of raw earth, and if you believe that true continental industrialization requires breaking the old extractive molds, then your engagement with this platform is vital. Add your voice to this growing global dialogue. Subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications, not simply to watch a video, but to actively participate in a community dedicated to uncovering the unvarnished realities of the fight for economic liberation. By standing with us, you help amplify the exact stories and perspectives that the traditional global establishment prefers to keep completely quiet. The geopolitical chessboard of the 21st century is being aggressively redrawn. For the first time in modern history, African nations are demanding the absolute right to be the architects of their own industries, their own economies, and their own futures. The notes being taken today by leaders across the continent will inevitably become the sovereign policies of tomorrow. To all our viewers across the global diaspora, thank you for your time, your sharp minds, and your unwavering commitment to a self-determined future. Stay vigilant. Keep questioning the dominant narrative and walk in peace until we meet again in our next analysis.